Professor Villon, thank you very much for your introduction. Much too kind, but the sense of responsibility that you referred to is something that we at the Governing Council of the ECB and within the Eurosystem, we feel very strongly. Good morning to all of you. Everything is okay, you've settled, you've managed to arrive despite the traffic, despite this slow-going move that has nothing to do with the move that we are observing at the moment in Europe. And this is something that we should be, I'm certainly, excited about. So let me start with a quote by someone that some of you might know. He's French. And some of you might think of Victor Hugo as a big proponent of Europe, Monet and Schumann and many others. Paul Valéry was a great supporter of Europe as well. And he wrote the following: "The trouble with our times is that the future is not what it used to be." He was copied many times by others, and that quote is attributed to other people, but it's him who started with it. And I think it's particularly fitting for the times, because our expectations have indeed been swept aside in the last few years, let alone the last few weeks. Established certainties about the international order have been upended. Some alliances have become strained, while others have drawn closer. We have seen political decisions that would have been just unthinkable a few years ago, a few months ago, a few weeks ago, just to see them overturned the following day. So the level of uncertainty we are facing is exceptionally high. An index of trade policy uncertainty currently stands at close to 350, which is more than 6 times its average value since 2021. And indicators of geopolitical risk stand at levels not seen since the Cold War, except for times of war and terrorism. This new environment raises fundamental questions for monetary policy. How can we deliver price stability in a new geopolitical era? As you said, Professor, our strategy assessment is ongoing under the leadership of Philip Lane, our chief economist, and brings together all Eurosystem experts in these fields. So I'm not going to cover every issue that they are currently discussing. This would not pay tribute to the work that is ongoing. But I will focus on the factors that I consider to be particularly relevant in this new era. And I will ask 3 questions, so bear with me. First, how is the environment in which we operate changing? Second, what do these changes imply for our reaction function? And third, what do those changes imply for our policy communication? My main message, and I will develop that and argue, is that in an environment of uncertainty, a strong commitment to maintaining price stability over the medium term is more important than ever. This commitment will require agility to respond to new shocks, but within a well-defined framework that limits short-sighted reactions and unbridled discretion. As a result, we will need to continue steering the public's expectations. People interested in us will be looking to us, and other policymakers, of course, to understand how we will navigate this more volatile era and help reduce rather than amplify uncertainty. So, is it just agility? No, it's agility combined with clarity. Even if we cannot provide certainty about the rate path, we can provide clarity about our reaction function. So let me go to those 3 questions that I have mentioned and look first of all at the environment. When we last reviewed our strategy in 2021, the main challenge we faced was a prolonged environment of too low inflation. Although the review provided lessons that are relevant under any circumstances, its main focus was on understanding the causes of too low inflation and how to ensure that it did not become embedded. Fast forward, look at the environment we are facing now, and three key changes stand out. First, the direction of shocks is much harder to predict. In the decade before our strategy review, we faced a range of structural and cyclical forces that were almost uniformly disinflationary. Now we are seeing notable shifts in the drivers of inflation. We still face structural factors like aging and digitalization that will probably be disinflationary in the coming years. But we are also now facing new two-sided shocks, mainly linked to trade and defense, as well as climate change, which can amplify or counteract existing forces. Trade fragmentation and higher defense spending in a capacity-constrained sector could, in principle, push inflation up. Yet US tariffs could also lower demand for EU exports and redirect excess capacity from China to Europe. That would push inflation down. That's for the direction. Looking now at the size of the shocks, they could potentially change. In the period between the great financial crisis to our last strategy review, 21, we faced some very large negative shocks to growth. The effect of these shocks on inflation, however, took time to materialize. We saw a slow-moving downward drift in inflation that eventually seeped into inflation expectations. But looking ahead, shocks might feed into inflation more directly and increase volatility. These risks may be particularly acute for the euro area, as we are highly exposed to some of the new types of shocks. So let me just mention two of them. The euro area is a very open economy and part of integrated supply chains. As a result, trade fragmentation is likely to lead to larger, more disruptive relative price changes. In a similar vein, the euro area is highly dependent on energy imports. Geopolitical risks are likely to drive greater volatility in exchange rates and energy and commodity prices, as we have seen in recent weeks. Direction, size. Let me now turn to the issue of persistence. One feature of the recent inflation shock was an increase in the frequency of price changes. We all received those notifications, terribly sorry, sales terms have changed, prices have changed, 3 months later yet again. This can lead to a steepening of the Phillips curve and more generally to a proportionally stronger impact of large shocks on inflation. A model developed at the ECB suggests that inflation behaves in a visibly non-linear way. It reacts disproportionately more strongly to large shocks, whereas small shocks trigger no significant reaction. If such state-dependent pricing becomes standard when the economy is hit by large shocks, but at the same time the frequency of wage setting remains below that of price adjustment, we could very well see inflation becoming more persistent. Large shocks would lead to a faster pass-through to inflation, and then wages would have to catch up with prices in a staggered way. Let me give you an example. Energy inflation peaked in the euro area in October 22. But services inflation only peaked in July 23, 9 months later, and is still being pushed up by past shocks today, mainly through their delayed impact on wage adjustment. In this current environment of more uncertain, larger, and possibly more persistent shocks, the way we have formulated our inflation target matters. What is it? We aim at 2% inflation. Our target is symmetric, and we work to achieve it over the medium term. This symmetric target has served us well during the recent inflation surge, helping to coordinate expectations and guide the inflation process back down towards 2%. But the formulation that we have adopted in 21, which lasts and will survive, does not mean that headline inflation will always be at 2%, which is impossible in the kind of environment we are facing now. It means that regardless of the shocks we face, we must set our policy appropriately so that inflation is always converging back to 2% over the medium term. So, how can we do that? And that brings me to my second question, the one that relates to our reaction function under those new circumstances. Our reaction function has always been state-dependent. In other words, policy should react differently depending on the context and the origin, size, and persistence of shocks. Our medium-term orientation enables us to avoid reacting to the small and passing shocks that will have faded away by the time the effect of our policy kicks in. And it allows us to flexibly adjust the horizon within which we must return inflation to target. Classically, monetary policy reacts more forcefully to demand shocks, where output and inflation move together, and looks through or reacts less to supply shocks that push output and inflation in opposite directions, if they are sufficiently small and transitory. Empirical evidence based on the last 20 years finds that the ECB has largely followed that prescription. Generally, it has reacted more strongly to demand shocks than to supply shocks, but it has responded to supply shocks more forcefully when these shocks were persistent and inflation was high. The new environment requires us to emphasize two factors. First factor is the anchoring of inflation expectations. For us at the ECB, looking through has always been conditional on inflation expectations remaining well anchored. The recent inflation surge has confirmed just how maintaining a strong anchoring is critical to successfully navigate a more volatile world. Our analysis finds that if inflation expectations had been as poorly anchored as it was in the 70s, our policy rates would have had to rise to 8% at the peak of the recent tightening cycle to tame inflation, with obviously very high costs for the economy. With well-anchored expectations, recent disinflation has instead been achieved at a relatively low cost compared with similar episodes of the past. This experience can, in some ways, give us confidence for the challenges ahead. The relative stability of longer-term inflation expectations during a massive inflation surge suggests that our inflation target has a high degree of credibility, which was reinforced by the decisive actions we took to keep inflation expectations anchored. But at the same time, our starting point for the recent inflation episode was a decade of too low inflation and correspondingly subdued inflation expectations. This meant that people were initially inattentive to inflation. What was that? And it took time for them to update their views. But there is some evidence that public awareness has been awakened by the recent experience. Once consumers really took notice of rising inflation, their inflation expectations and perceptions responded quickly, but reduced more sluggishly when inflation started to fall. This sluggish response has contributed to the slow adjustment of consumer expectations, especially 1 year ahead. We will only know through careful observation how long these memories will last, and consequently how sensitive inflation expectations will be to new shocks. But in all scenarios, close monitoring of inflation expectations across markets, analysts, forecasters, households and firms through all means available will be central to our policy reaction function. Now, once the anchoring of inflation expectations is assured, the second factor we need to assess is how the current environment affects the optimal policy reaction to different types of shocks. If the Phillips curve becomes steeper at higher levels of inflation, meaning inflation responds faster to changes in activity, then it should also be easier for monetary policy to bring inflation down without imposing heavy costs on the economy. This would weaken one of the main rationales for looking through large supply shocks. But at the same time, there may be risks in generalizing from recent experience where disinflation was relatively painless. Alongside well-anchored inflation expectations, the relatively low sacrifice ratio during this disinflation episode may reflect a unique set of conditions that will not be applicable to future shocks. In particular, the fact that we faced a series of negative shocks to income reduced the extent to which demand needed to be dampened by monetary tightening. Any future shocks that we face, such as energy price shocks and supply chain disruptions, or a large increase in spending in defense and infrastructure, will therefore have to be assessed through this framework. All being said, simple policy prescriptions will not be appropriate in the environment that we now face. Within a well-articulated strategy and an unwavering commitment to price stability, we will need to retain agility to respond to complex circumstances as they arise. And this obviously has implications for our policy communication, and that's the third and last question that I'm going to explore. Maintaining agility affects how we can talk about the future. And this applies particularly to our ability to give detailed guidance on the future path of interest rates. Forward guidance about the rate path is particularly useful under two circumstances. First, when the economy is faced with one-sided persistent shocks pushing it towards the effective lower bound. In this setting, it gives the public confidence that monetary policy will be sufficiently persistent to dislodge those shocks and deliver on its target, while also helping insulate monetary conditions from spillovers from abroad. These benefits were all visible in the euro area from 2013 onwards, when we first introduced rate forward guidance. Second circumstances where it is helpful, when shocks become two-sided following a long time at the lower bound. In this case, it can help to lay out the conditions for rate lift in a way that hedges against false positives and prevents a premature tightening, and as a result reduces uncertainty about the future path of rates. But one of the lessons of the recent period is that such guidance can become less helpful when uncertainty about the nature of the shocks is rising. In particular, some of the lift-off criteria we applied to our 2021 rate forward guidance were tied to the baseline inflation projections. But our projections were slow in catching on to the reality of much more persistent inflation shocks. The combination of factors that created this shock, I remind you, worldwide pandemic, producing bottlenecks in various sectors upon reopening of a major energy crisis, not to mention a war, had not been seen since the end of World War I. But with insight, it would have been beneficial in our forward guidance to explicitly account for the risks and uncertainty surrounding the baseline. So a general conclusion emerges. When the size and distribution of shocks become highly uncertain, we cannot provide certainty by committing to a particular rate path. Otherwise, forward guidance may constrain policy agility in the face of abrupt changes to the inflation environment. Disappointment? No. Because we can provide clarity not about the rate path for the reason that I have explained, but about our reaction function. We can still help the public, to understand how we will navigate the new environment. First, we can clarify how we are likely to be affected by different states of the world. Since the pandemic, the ECB has been making greater use of scenario analysis, sensitivity analysis, precisely to make our policy more robust to changing circumstances. These exercises, together with our discussion of the balance of risks, are designed to ensure that policymaking can remain forward-looking and stay ahead of the shocks to come. At present, under the circumstances we're facing, we are considering various scenarios related to tariffs and fiscal policy changes, for instance, and what that would imply for growth and inflation. Second, we can clarify what kind of data we will look at to make our decisions, which helps the public to distinguish signals from noise. This is why in March 2022, we set out 3 key inputs for policy decisions: the inflation outlook, comprising both the baseline and the risks around it, the dynamics of underlying inflation, and the strength of monetary policy transmission. You would remember that in the early phase of our rate tightening, before these criteria were introduced, we saw large monetary policy shocks linked both to rate decisions and indications on future rates, as markets were looking for orientation. But after March 23, market moves were less pronounced despite similar levels of interest rates uncertainty, which suggests that the markets better understood our reaction function. We also saw increased sensitivity to new data releases in the early tightening phase. But this diminished as markets understood which data we were focusing on, and especially that data dependence should not be confused with data point dependence. The lesson I draw from that is that laying out a clear reaction function is critical to tempering volatility in a world of exceptional uncertainty. The public must understand the distribution of possible outcomes ahead and how the central bank will react once it is sufficiently confident about which scenario it is facing. In this way, clarity on the reaction function can be seen as providing not forward guidance, but framework guidance. It's a type of guidance that comes from the discipline implicit in a monetary policy framework, without pre-committing to any particular rate path, as the latter would, as I said, exceedingly constrain the necessary agility. The 3 inputs we are currently using are designed to deliver robust policy in the face of the particular constellation of shocks that have hit the euro in recent years, especially the staggered pass-through of a large inflation surge to wages. Whether we continue to use those same inputs in future will depend on the nature of the shocks that confront us, and we will clarify what they are. Our strategy assessment should nonetheless commit to integrating risk and uncertainty about key factors into our reaction function. The data we draw on should capture not only our central projection for the economy, but also the uncertainty surrounding that projection and a rich, diverse set of risks. So I've quoted Paul Valéry to start, and I will quote an American president to finish. Fred? Thomas Jefferson, the great Thomas Jefferson, said, and you know the quote, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." We wish. The same can be said about stability. Maintaining stability in a new era will be a formidable task. It will require an absolute commitment to our inflation target. The ability to pass which types of shocks will require a monetary reaction, and the agility to react appropriately. Our response to the recent inflation episode should give the public and you confidence that we will always do whatever is necessary to deliver price stability, and that our policy frameworks can adapt to new circumstances. I thank you for your attention.